Oh, I'm 21 minutes into Sam Vaknin's video, Sex, Love with Other Races, Religions, Ethnicities, Minorities, Outgroups, in inverted commas. Anyway, he hasn't actually gotten to talking about that issue. Well, I mean, he has in the sense that all of these things I don't think matter, races, religions, ethnicities, because he, he says minority outgroups. When he started bringing up this topic, he started talking about just the general lay of the land, and he's obviously made a large commentary on some of these things, about the which he gets into where he talks about feminism and the unigender and the gender. What does he call it? The gender. Uh, oh man, I can't remember the phrase that he uses, but it's something like the gender. Uh, Confusion in the culture, that there's essentially a kind of a stasis. I mean, I wish I could, but that it's all sort of stuck in a kind of it's all frozen in place, or something like that. Anyway, and then he makes some very sort of common sense, sort of connections. I slightly disagree with him. I think he's kind of got it slightly in reverse. I mean, he says these almost truisms that gender roles are like the precondition for sexuality. You can't really have sexual feelings except between some kind of dynamic between um, gender roles, and so without having differential gender roles, there's nothing to have a kind of a sexual dance around, as it were, in terms of how people would correspond to one another in some kind of sexual dynamic, or sort of relational interchange or interplay. Anyway, the thing that I want to disagree with Professor Sam Vaknin is that, I mean, he's roughly correct, but he's created nouns out of all of these components, and in some sense I think that he gives pretty accurate reading on what the problem is, you know uh, between, and I think it really is all to do with feminism. It's all to do with and he says, that some people have even thought about throwing away the borderline label, because essentially so many women are just sufferers of complex stress, complex trauma, and post-traumatic stress, that then they are manifesting, um, essentially they're all a bit psychopathic and narcissistic, and that culturally they are modeling themselves off of a kind of narcissistic and psychopathic male, and that's what he calls the unigender. Now, I mean, maybe this is a distinction without a difference, but I don't think that it is the unigender. I mean, in some sense it is and it isn't. This emergence of the gender, I can't remember the phrase that he uses again, but the gender stasis, or the gender um, confusion in the culture around sex and gender, or whatever. Um, Obviously, the lack of gender roles means that you can't facilitate, let's say, sexuality, because there's nothing to ground it in. There's no shared reality. There's no model that can be played between the two participants. Um, and I do think that also what I'm saying largely corresponds even to homosexual sexuality. I think there's, in fact, gender roles are probably more important on some level. It might not be divided in some kind of conventional way, but I think all human sexuality, in some sense, is negotiated in the personal realm of the interaction, and the gender role has a particular shared instantiation, which is the sexual connection, or the connection within the realm of sexuality, or something like that. But anyway, I just have a slightly different explanation. My explanation is that the kinds of thing that he is talking about in terms of how women are modeling themselves, or perhaps victims of post-traumatic stress, and are basically psychopathic and borderline, I would take a slightly different. I mean, it's true, it's slightly true, whatever. But I would say that sexuality, if you are that kind of psychopath, if you are that kind of narcissistic psychopath, sort of borderline, labile, all that sort of stuff, your sexuality is not, um, you know, your sexuality is based on a kind of internal relativism. It's basically, I mean, narcissists are very impersonal in their sadistic, sort of extraction of narcissistic supply of other people. Um, anyway, oh, it's interesting. The the woman, or the academic writer who Sam Vaknin was talking about, who is basically saying that we should just basically say that so many of these women are basically, they all have their unique personality disorder in some sense, and that they're basically all victims of post-traumatic stress. Um, I don't buy that. I don't buy that it's complex post-traumatic stress. I think that's a very I think it's a cultural emergence of a sexuality. I think that this even the sexlessness within the youth, which Sam Vaknin is talking about, and things like that, and let's say the lack of sexuality in this unigendered framework, it's not because of the lack of the gender role, it's because the gender role itself engages in sexuality in a non-sexual way, that essentially the sexual energy comes in trying to subjugate or control the partner into the narrative that is relativistically, so essentially it's not a shared reality, it's a unilateral container which the other person is just looking for endorsement from the outside. And that obviously is a very kind of solipsistic kind of sexuality. It's not fun to engage in. It's very impersonal. It's very sort of based on a kind of sadistic toying of the other person. It's very one-sided. It's very, and anyway, that I think is, I mean, although I would describe it as obviously dysfunctional sexuality, I don't think that these people are sexless. I mean, the thing that is sexless is the lack of perhaps the biological, mechanical act or whatever, but it's because they have dispersed their sexual expression into essentially a kind of political game, a political game of subjugation. So their feminist politics, as it were, is the substitute of actual. It is a kind of sexual expression. Uh, it's just yeah. I mean, look, I know that maybe I could be accused of playing a kind of semantic game here, um, but I would say that what we're dealing with is not sexlessness. It's the sublimation of sexual of the sexual drive into a political uh, um, arena, and of extracting narcissistic supply, essentially. Um, and so, the kind of low quality sex which feminists have, which is very um, both ways. It is, either they explore the forbidden aspect of their own ideology, where they are trying to reenact sort of the worst kind of stereotypical, sort of unconscious shadow that is cast by their ideological nonsense, and they want that to be very scripted, and it has to kind of it, so it's almost like the inversion of their belief structure, and how they and so it's kind of, in some sense, it's I would say the individuals, the feminists that engage in that kind of bullshit essentially are trying to be a more sophisticated kind of borderline. They are trying to show that their internal relativism can have anything and everything, can have it both ways, that they can sort of control psychological reality to that extent that they can sort of get a male participant or a sexual participant to take their reframing of the situation, that they can sort of be sadistically denigrating in their ideology while being sort of some kind of mock mimicry of a kind of sexual submission. But usually the quality of that is because they don't switch off their ideology while they're enacting that kind of sexual play. They're kind of witnessing through the valence of that ideology while they're engaging in the sex. And so they are, it's kind of like they are charging their ideological grievance. It's a kind of vampirism. It's a kind of energy vampirism, that is there essentially to sadistically judge the masculine enactment that they want. I mean, it's literally like engaging in a kind of dead vampiristic exchange. It's anyway. So there's that, and then there's the kind of in some sense, I think that is the only sort of stable sexual sort of thing. The other thing is just a kind of is superficial toying around, where essentially it's very sort of clinical, and in some sense it's based again on a kind of mockery of the act itself, or a kind of diminution of the actual of what the act, so it's weird that you've got all these sociological layers being projected into the bedroom, into sort of an intimate space. So it's not an intimate space. It's it's a mess. So there is, so I mean, you can just see why the topic of sexuality is basically completely sublimated by the politics of the identity, essentially. So I don't consider, I mean, so sex, love with other races, religions, ethnicities, minority groups. I mean, like, please. I mean, how? It's not that hard to be a classically liberally minded person, and all of those things don't really mean anything in the shared reality that can be created between two participants. It's not an issue if someone is in an out group. The only issue really is, in some sense, the feminist mentality, the politicization of sexuality, which is essentially the anyway. I haven't listened to this whole recording, so I mean, maybe there'll be more things for me to comment on. But so yeah, I mean, I do take issue with this idea that we live in a monogender role. I don't think we do, because I think that these ideologues or these feminists, although they are playing out some kind of narcissistic, psychopathic male valence of an identity, although that is the gender role that they are aspiring to, or something like that, I don't think it's masculine. I just think that it is fundamentally, it's not about the sexuality of two participating individuals. It has no, I mean, in some sense, I mean, perhaps I'm going to reveal too much about my own personal opinion, perhaps, or something like that. But I mean, the gender roles themselves within sexual congress, there is a complete equality in the sense that that they fundamentally correspond. You know, like, I mean, Sam Vaknin has even explored this conceptually. You know, like, so, you know, the feminists will try to politicize sex and say, oh, sex is such a demeaning act because the male is penetrating the female. The male sex organ penetrates the female sex organ. I mean, this is complete bullshit. Like, you could just as easily say that the female sex organ engulfs the male sex organ. Why is penetration more submissive than engulfing? So the supposed gender role itself is within itself, it has a kind of fractal of being reframed while still amounting to the same, you know, function that is shared. So you have a shared physical function, which is then being dynamically as a shared reality has to come into some kind of merging or something like that. And when that is happening, that's basically being negotiated mentally. I mean, I think that, you know, this is what sexuality is essentially, it's not having one idea, it's having one idea and then another idea and then another idea that conflicts. And that is an evolution or a development of the participation of the interplaying participants. So being able to shift between these, let's say, to shift the shared context of the contributing components of reality within a shared paradigm. That, you know, I mean, that's what gender roles facilitate. Is that, you know, on some level, you have to start with some kind of cultural convention, so that you have something to play off, so that you have a conventional set of basic, you know, I mean, it's like, because when you, it's in the same way that if you walked up to someone and started talking to them, you wouldn't invent language in the conversation. You would use the already existing language and then convey the unique or particular discerning, because we don't all, you know, we don't all mean the same thing when we say the same word. You know, context matters, as it were, but the context needs a kind of conventional form to at least initiate its negotiation. Okay, so anyway, so that's my view of what sexuality actually is. Okay, so and it is facilitated through conventions to some degree, because you need an initiating starting block. Okay, but this idea that the reason why sexuality isn't happening is because in some sense, okay, in some sense I do think that everyone is both, what's the word, because someone's understanding, because someone needs an understanding of both gender roles, otherwise you don't embody your own gender role anyway. And so embodying your own gender role is a way to signal your understanding of both of them, because that is what people are connecting with. They're not just connecting with an opposing gender role, they're corresponding with a negotiated shared understanding of both. And let me just say that understanding does include therefore, let's say the spectrum of valence, or the capacity to embody both the energies or something like this. So anyway, what I'm basically trying to say is that, so I'm a kind of spiritual, hermetical, alchemical, sort of philosophical thinker. So I think that people are basically, in essence, they have to have both genders on the level of spiritual understanding. So, like, to me, there is already only one true gender, and it's both, essentially. But it's both distinct, different genders combined, not one, not solitary or something like that. The idea that you're going to say that there's a unigender and it's this male psychopathic narcissistic valence is just a way of saying that that there is a sexuality out there that is a kind of that is so unilaterally self-invested that it's just looking for followers, it's just looking for toys to play with, it's not looking for participants. But I don't think that's because there are two males in the room. That's not what it is. It's that you have a narcissistic psychopath, which is culturally taken to be the new sort of feminine thing. And I mean, yeah, again, like I must say, whenever I keep on hearing too much of this bullshit from academics, that where it's always this, oh, well, women have been so subjugated for so long that obviously when things have changed, then suddenly they all turn out to be psychopaths and narcissists because of their complex stress and their complex trauma. This is bullshit. This is utter bullshit. I mean, come on, how can you... This is a fudged fucking ideological narrative. It's disgusting. I mean, this is obviously a culturally propagated paradigm. This again, you see, this is why my model, I think, is obviously more correct. It's not that these people were abused growing up sociologically or some bullshit like that, so then they become narcissists. It's because they have been sold this model of sexuality as this kind of control game, as this kind. It has been ideologically signaled to them. It has been ideologically programmed and indoctrinated into them, to sort of play this kind of this victim game and this victim card, and then and now you want to rebrand that as complex post-traumatic stress. I mean, well, if it is, I mean, I maybe the properties of that diagnosis are, maybe they do hold better than borderline personality disorder, but I'll tell you that they are the vectors of their own complex post-traumatic stress. It's not environmental trauma. They have perhaps you need a modulation of that, of the etymology of and development of that psychopathology. But anyway, so yeah, and I mean, sort of again, also complaining about the manosphere. If I have to listen to more of this shitty complaining about the manosphere all the time. I mean, yeah, I guess the only thing that you can say about, I mean, there are some criticisms that, sort of some of the, I mean, yeah, the toxic gurus that give, this kind of this evolutionary sort of sociological sort of narrative as to the natural order, as to try to create some kind of moral narrative that can be used as a kind of as a stopgap measure, as a bulwark against the feminist sort of narrative. As I say, like that is the simplest solution for identity politics, is you kind of create your own identity politics that basically says no, we already have a narrative that we are following. We're already controlled. We already believe in a story, and so we can't be imperialized by your narrative because we already follow a kind of in an imperial identitarian, sort of minded mentality that keeps us protected from your identitarian, sort of narrative of victimization. So, I mean, yeah, there are sort of toxic people in the manosphere who are essentially just trying to create their own sort of version of feminism, but in some sense I would still give them some sympathy because they're doing it defensively in some sense, and the kind of identity that they are trying to craft is an identity that shows that, men have the capacity to both be rational and reasonable and supportive and responsible for other people, and sort of in some sense they are trying to protect some basic and then the idea is that, well, then women come in and then they sort of they craft society and they twist it around sort of their different kind of biological imperative, and because society itself has been built essentially on male disposability, men have had to create institutional structures and integrity within society in order just to kind of make sure that they get credit, they get the requisite credit, so that they get the requisite status, so that they don't get thrown away in the sexual marketplace, or the ability to reproduce, that their meritorious service actually gets reflected in the cultural esteem or something like that. Okay, maybe I've just kind of steel-manned, both the criticism against the manosphere and some of the voices in the manosphere. Maybe I've steel-manned both of those too much. That I'm just trying to show sort of the basic tension. But I mean, again, like, this is generally speaking a reaction to sort of the one-sided narcissistic psychopathy of women, which to not treat that as essentially the initial aggravating cause of the problems in this area is essentially to, because if you don't diagnose the proximate cause and actually tackle that or treat that, you're just going to facilitate a never-ending sort of perpetual Cold War or conflagration. To end a war, you have to say which side was wrong, which side did the wrong thing, or something like that. You actually have to have an agreement about what you have to have an agreement upon which a settlement can be crafted. And if we, and in some sense, like, I don't mind what people agree about or disagree about, but what you agree or disagree about has to be requisitely truthful, that it can service as an ongoing premise of a functional, workable way of relating to one another. And so this is why it is important to say, things like, this is not complex post-traumatic stress, or if it is, it's self-imposed by a kind of cultural fad. It's a fashionable cultural, sort of anyway. And in some sense, a lot of this cerebration is fundamentally premised on holding women unaccountable for their moral laxity, or their moral obtuseness. I mean, all of this bullshit from feminism and identity politics is all grounded in the idea that morality is concerned with the group, with some kind of identity category, that morality is centered around a group. It's not centered around individuals. It's fundamentally dehumanizing. Um, it's fundamentally casting aspersions, accusations, and kind of in a projection of caretakership on everyone that you disagree with. So not only do you say that, like, I have a problem, but the solution to the problem is that people that don't agree with me need to solve the problem that I have. So it's got this sort of fundamental disempowering paradox, which just can continue to generate grievance. It's and that's how it sort of sustains its own addiction to itself, and how it sort of then has to go and create parasitic, vampiristic, sort of versions of sexuality to sustain its strange outlook. Anyway, okay, let me stop talking. But I mean, I don't, do other people not get this? Like when I'm watching the Sam Vaknin video, 21 minutes, and I keep on hearing the same shallow, hollow, repetitive claims that Sam Vaknin makes, which essentially to me seem to me designed to placate some kind of academic, entrenched, sort of ideological position, because they have to play the identity politics game, because they're sort of they're in the same way that a lot of these academics sort of toe the line. They have to sort of reproduce. They can't directly oppose the identitarian or identity politics sentiments too much. They have to just kind of retell them in a reframed formulation. That's as far as they will go, essentially. They can't directly confront or oppose it, or call it out. Anyway, I think I've dealt with this topic somewhat comprehensively enough. I guess I'll see if there's an addendum to be made, but because I guess I gave my own treatment of the topic of sexuality. Man, I'm finding it hard to concentrate on the Sam Vaknin video. It's 26 minutes in and he hasn't gotten to talking about the identity factions that is in the title of the recording. But I guess he's sort of trying to make a standalone video about sexuality, so he has to cover a lot of ground to recapitulate things in his other recordings on the matter. But I just wanted to make an addendum to clean up, well, not even, just to elaborate one thing that I mentioned, which was actually a quote from Sam Vaknin, which was, sort of the reframing of the sexual act from what some feminists cast it as sort of the act of being penetrated, which sort of has all these weird layers of projection from the ideological narrative, to how you could reframe it as being engulfed. Now, that is a word that Sam Vaknin has used to reframe it. I think he used other descriptions as well. This might have been one of them, but a much more accurate description is probably containment. The idea that the female sex organ is containing the male sex organ. And containment itself, in some sense, is one of those, let's say, abstract ways of, all of this is somewhat abstract, all of this is a mental construct or something like that, which is what is being brought to the table to create a shared bubble of an engaged reality of which is the work of intimacy, is to forging a shared and corresponding reality. But it is interesting that the gender roles themselves, therefore, I mean, I prefer the word containment, because even if you want to cast that the male um, is going to have a particular understanding, understanding is something uh, that is internal. Understanding is something that is in your own personal discerning, or whatever. It's your own internal structure. So accepting somebody else, or negotiating, or having a shared understanding, means that at some point someone has to contain the other person's point of view. Um, and obviously so I mean, it's just interesting that even within the gender roles themselves, abstracted and reframed in certain ways, you can see how the one is a direct reflection of the other, that in some sense there is much more similarity in terms of the actual, if you are going to make a shared reality out of it, if you are going to make a negotiated exchange between the distinct and separate different gender roles, they do already have, let's say, the basic components of replicating the other's uh, of reflecting the other's contents. So I know these things are obviously correspondent. I mean, that's the basic, that they correspond in such a basic way that they can be, and obviously how they correspond, how they are framed to correspond, is in some sense the work of having a negotiated, shared, engaged participation in intimacy. Anyway, I just wanted to, because engulf is essentially a purely physical description, um, whereas containment is, let's say, more abstract and conducive to the point that that you can really make a fractal out of this, that you can use it as a canvas within which to share a kind of it's it's something to be used to model something that is it's a symbolic conduit of something that's more immaterial, as in it's more of an expression of a very basic form of connection in terms of one's inspiration and motivation, and using a conduit through which to explored a shared and agreed upon sort of experience, because sometimes the experience is so basic that without the frames of reference being brought to the table and being negotiated, there's very little play and activity to be had. The act itself is a without the layers of significance which are projected onto it in a negotiated way, that is the whole. I mean, that is the field of sexuality itself. Without that, there isn't sexuality. There's just sort of animal copulation. You can only use clinical terms, purely clinical terms. But that's my point. Is that words like containment are fundamentally have an ephemeral latitude, that is the exploration of that is the nature of sexuality itself. Anyway, I don't want to get into sort of sex poetry of showing how, you know, different things can be seen as essentially as a metaphorical, but also that there are parities within the metaphor, but that the metaphor itself is comprised of mechanical parts which are fundamentally not the same, but which metaphorically can find equivalencies to one another, but they involve a different mode, a different kind of physical contribution, but in the shared frame there is an exact parity about, you know, I mean, if you can't find an agreement about what things mean, and I mean, in some sense, this is not meant to be negotiated verbally. It's meant, or I mean, there can be perhaps an aspect of that, but in some sense, it's meant to be more fundamentally direct, I would say, and that it's negotiated, let's say, through energy, through a kind of psychological communion, as it were. That is, you know, sort of you know, and that's also, you know, the point of intimacy, the point of being able to know someone without, anyway, I mean, I don't want to sexualize this too much, because in some sense this is the layer of human intuition, this is a layer of human communication, the non-verbal communication, you know. So this is not just you know, being able to know what someone you know, essentially, I mean, what I'm trying to describe is essentially a form of almost of sort of non-verbal telepathy, you know, that essentially that people I don't know if I'm describing it correctly, but, you know, that there is a kind of familiarization of essentially how somebody else thinks, how they, you know, that you have a shared model of each other, and, you know, and their understanding, you know, and this can be very intellectual. This doesn't have to, you know, that kind of. So I mean, yeah, I don't want to say that being familiar with someone sort of must have a sexual metaphorical anyway. I mean, this is also why sex can and has been used, you know, for creating a strong relationship and bond that, you know, and healing, and a kind of psychological healing perhaps between obviously that's perhaps slightly problematic in terms of to say that sex is a healing modality. I mean, in some sense it's I mean, perhaps it facilitates that because of the you know, sort of the pair bond and the kind of the collateral support, and in some sense the merger of the understanding, that the containment of one understanding and the duplication of the other understanding. I shouldn't have actually said duplication. I should have said replication. Um, anyway, I mean, I was just sort of inspired to make this recording after I was just watching a little bit of Jordan Peterson, and he was answering a question about, you know, like why the feminine is symbolically characterized as chaos, and is interesting because you know, the question also had in it, you know, oh, I have these feminist friends, and they have this question or whatever, and it's it's interesting the kind of hypocrisy which, or the weird sort of double standard which Jordan Peterson pointed out. Well, you could ask the feminists why do they characterize the male symbol? Why do they symbolically sort of characterize masculinity as order? And are they not constantly asking for, and in some sense, even in their own feminist ideology, are they not demanding that the order should be rejected and that they reject the order and that they want the order to be restructured or something like that? And so, if you reject order, then, that would rationally, you could sort of boil that down in a one-word thing to chaos. But essentially, I mean, you can also see how this is perhaps reflected in the sexual act in terms of the rejection of containment, the rejection of anyway, I didn't necessarily want to make that stark comparison, but in some sense it overlaps with the theme that I was generally saying, that essentially that the political project is essentially the sublimation of the sexual energy in some sense. Anyway, I did want to emphasize one of the points that Jordan Peterson made. I mean, yeah. So I mean, if you do want to sort of reject traditional gender roles, I don't think that you can sort of reject them. I think that you can try to take responsibility for both of them. That if you're going to reject order, then you should provide. I mean, if you're going to reject order, let's say, perpetually, sort of petulantly, then, and sort of claim to be beyond gender roles or something like that, so that is almost a sort of a dangerous and unsustainable, kind of psychopathology, and that the only way, that you have to sort of grow to supply some order yourself, that you actually have to state what the ulterior is, rather than just sort of saying that things aren't good enough continually, that you have to take responsibility for both gender roles. And in some sense, I think that this is a general claim about sexuality itself, but I think that in some sense, I think people don't want to do that. They don't want to be completely armored or developed as an individual, because if they were, then they couldn't get into the kind of the lowbrow drama of a kind of a sexual dynamic and drama, which is quite uncreative, which is quite set in a very sort of particular problem solution, which they need to sort of be at loggerheads with a gender role which is sort of offering them something which they're not ready to sort of acclimate to, or to properly assimilate, and then to creatively explore after, because in some sense the idea is that, it's almost as if these people, they crave a kind of low key consistent conflict, because, or, which is either within the bedroom or projected outwardly on the political stage of life or something like that, as a substitute for this kind of, because in some sense that is an expression of their purpose in life, seeking, or ostensibly seeking, some kind of ultimate resolution, when it's really just, anyway, I'm making a very broad claim about sort of the lack of self-actualization and the lack of drive towards self-actualization manifesting as a kind of, as a very repetitive sexual dramatization, and sex can be used like that. What's my point? In the same way, perhaps I'm broadening the definition of sex to be so broad that it's kind of like the unresolved territory of your own kind of existential position around your identity, or something like that, or it can certainly be used like that. And this is why I think, some sexual connections with people can include quite a lot of healing, because essentially you very quickly see that the other person is participating in a very high level, and therefore you develop to meet them at that level, or it turns very bad, and the sexual chemistry is essentially, sexual chemistry perhaps can be misaligned for other reasons as well, but essentially there's just a kind of, there's a complete mismatch in terms of the level at which the self is being expressed, and so where there's a very high disparate mismatch in terms of the level of the engagement, which is also perhaps a complicated subject, because there are perhaps harmonics as well, that certain levels of disparateness can perhaps have certain, perhaps even pedagogical interactions in which someone can, I guess that would be linked to the idea of sort of sexual healing and things like that. It would just be another kind of, so in some sense you could have a level of play if both participants were capable of engaging in that level of play, even if they are coming at it from, let's say, a disparate level, and a mismatch of essentially the kind of game that they are orientated towards preferring, or something like that. Anyway, I'm really changing the topic now. I don't want to go into all these rabbit holes, but there's just so there does seem to be something about feminism which is sort of holding on to a kind of a problem solution and trying to pursue that drama around that problem solution and not have that issue exhausted. And so there's a kind of, there's an overdeveloped defense mechanism around sustaining and insulating the kind of the excuse for engaging in this sort of petty dramatization and this kind of sadistically edged, vampiristic, sort of relationship with external players or something, or external participants. And in some sense, the strategy, I think, is it's interesting because, the modern feminist or something like that, Sam Vaknin says that, these people look like narcissistic, psychopathic males. But in some sense, I think that there is something female about this perniciousness, that it is a kind of a perpetual agent of chaos that is sort of doubling down in having that influence over other people. So it's interesting that essentially the continual rejection of order, of not wanting to of perpetually not wanting to contain any order, because to understand any kind of order is just not good enough. So they're kind of like, they are this monopole of a that is not comprised of a balance between male and female, because it's sort of it's in the character of rejecting order, but not in supplementing for what it is that they reject. So they don't have an alternative. They just have essentially the expression of dissatisfaction. And without the interest or anything like that, to actually pursue any type of sort of correspondence or participation or collaboration with anything that threatens its characteristic of being a perpetual agent of rejection of order, or an agent of chaos. And so it's sort of it's so entrenched in this sort of parasitic unilateral identity. Anyway, Sam Vaknin said in this recording that he was going to talk about toxic femininity, and I'm not even halfway, or I'm about halfway through it, but I haven't gotten to that point yet. But oh my word, it's getting hard to listen to this, because he still hasn't mentioned anything in the title of the recording. But I guess I should be the last person to complain about people labeling things and talking a lot about other things. Anyway, I don't know if I'm making a concise point there, but that's just that just perhaps more fully deals with the topic itself. Okay, I finally got to the point in the video where Sam Vaknin talks about the title and the topic, and yeah, I mean, I've actually commented about this when I was talking to Good Mother on a stream one time. This is again, like, this sort of false moral equivalency between men and women in this, that this gender divide is not generically a divide between the genders. It's not a war and of acrimony on both sides. it was instigated by one side, and it was instigated, and in some sense, it's even a reflection in what Sam Vaknin is surveying as the problem itself, is that, it's predominantly centered on white people. This is predominantly a white people problem, or something like that. Well, that's because of the nature of the political sexual sublimation of the political project, which is, more about feminism than it is, or more about the nature of the ideology of feminism. And so, as this bleeds into identity politics, which he kind of is obtusely sort of talking about without talking about it directly, um, again, like, this would all not be a problem if we just had, let's say, principles and moral values which were centered on the individual. And so, again, like, he's using the sociological phenomena as a way to make, I mean, this is what sociological analysis always do, is that you reduce things down to groups and statistics, and then you can't actually see the wood from the trees. So I would say that, this kind of, frankly, I'll say sophomoric analysis, sadly, is exactly the kind of the bait and the lure of, sort of the identity politics bug, that once it bites you, it just, its analysis spreads like wildfire, unless you actually have sort of the backbone to bootstrap it down into some kind of principled moral analysis on the level of the individuals that are engaging in this kind of phenomena. So I mean, I think that my analysis of the actual toxic, the toxic sexuality that is perpetrated by feminists of this ilk, that is the real source and the real nexus of all of this pathology around, or dysfunction around sexuality, is all coming from feminism and feminist ideology and feminist sort of driven culture that has created this sexual persona, or the sexual stereotype, or this cultural ideal around what the feminine sexual expression is, which is, in some sense, Sam Vaknin would call it, like a male narcissistic psychopath. I would say that it is actually it is a contorted, it is a kind of asexual feminine chaos agent that is fundamentally parasitic, and it's parasitic on other people's sexual energy in some sense, in ideologically framing and relativistically judging other people's sexual energy in some sense. And they can, let's say, escape that to some degree by engaging in some kind of intimacy or sexuality in an outgroup, where the same ideological accusation, the same scapegoating, isn't part of the sexual. So when they are at home in their sexless marriage, as or when they're in their in-group, and there's a weird sublimation of the sexual layer of culture and society and potential between individuals, when that has been sublimated into a political conflagration around feminist ideology, when you're dealing with the outgroup, they don't have the same, they get a free pass, because it's all about degrading the scapegoat, the ideological scapegoat, which is, archetypally, or whatever, which is, explicitly identified as the white male patriarchy, and the rejection of any kind of understanding that comes from a white, male identity, or something like that. I mean, it's basic bigotry. It's base, crude bigotry, essentially, which is supposedly a kind of sexual persona, and they can supposedly engage in sexuality with members of the so-called outgroup, because members of the so-called outgroup aren't the ideological scapegoats. So they're it's kind of like a culturally sanctioned pocket in which, let's say, more normal sexual mechanics can sort of engage in, but essentially because the outgroup itself has also got its own toxic identity politics, because of the cultural fad and fashion at the moment. So I mean, he's just basically describing sexual dysfunction that comes along with the inculcation of fascistic sexual morality, because the fascistic values and the political sort of fascistic slide of from the feminist ideology, from the intersectional bullshit and all that sort of stuff, has inculcated into people a moral obtuseness about individuality, and a kind of moral projection based on these disgusting, bigoted sort of standards, and having to play kind of vampiristic games with people, and that has destroyed sexuality and created, let's say, a kind of has forced people towards also enacting the ideology itself, because that's when you're having sex with your outgroup because it's like morally sanctioned in the fascistic value system, because then you're being a good you're being a good adherent to undermining the structural oppression, or whatever the victim narrative is, or whatever. You're disrupting the system, like a good ally and a good adherent. You're also, I mean, although you're also indirectly being bigoted. Sort of like the bigotry of soft racism. You are also essentially, you're not having a relationship with someone. You're having a relationship because of the identity that they aren't. It's sort of, it's fundamentally dehumanizing. So I think that these people, even though they might be able to enact some kind of visceral human interaction on some level, it's still going to be fundamentally degraded, because you're dealing with people that are morally and principally obtuse. These are people, this is a generation that has been inculcated into the worst kind of unprincipled. These are people, quite frankly, they have evil ideological structures in their mind. They should have fucked up lives, and they do have fucked up lives. Good for them. I mean, like, if you don't want to have a backbone, if you don't want to stand for something, and you want to fall for the cultural fad and fashion, and women are destroying themselves in this way. They are not happy because they have created a sexual addiction and a sexual persona and a sexual cultural ideal around rejecting, around being sadistically edged, around being essentially punitive, for the resentment that they have, and which they inculcate within themselves. They are agents of chaos. They are somewhat, they are monsters, and as they have set themselves up in this, they make it impossible to have real intimacy possible, even in their out-group, whatever, in the things that Sam Vaknin is describing, and the behavior that Sam Vaknin is describing about people trying to get intimacy from their out-group because their in-group is sexless. And primarily it's just the white culture that is doing the sexlessness. Well, this is obviously a reflection of the feminist intersectional ideological sort of bent. And Sam Vaknin trying to sociologically talk about this in the most I'm sorry, but there is a level of, so you want to complain about the manosphere, you want to complain, but you're not going to seriously, you're just going to call it a gender divide and a gender war. Like, if you're not going to be serious about, like actually looking at the substance of this, because you're just going to look at it from a sociological lens, so that you say, oh, well, there's a gender war and there's a gender divide. And you're not going to look at the actual content of the ideology, the actual content of the ideas themselves. And, like, there's no, this is such an obtuse analysis, which is frankly just reframing identity politics, well, seemingly disguising it to some degree. Look, I'm being slightly too harsh here. So Vaknin is perhaps, he's trying to open a can of worms, which is very sensitive in the environment that he comes from. He even explicitly says that you can't talk about this kind of stuff. It's taboo essentially within the academy. So he's taking a huge risk even talking about it obtusely. But you know, it's watching him tiptoe around these issues and have to somewhat dishonestly formulate them so he can sort of not get fired or not be completely rejected by his field. It's uh, I just want to emphasize again, it's disgusting and conspicuous, how essentially the academic excuse that he brings up is that, oh, well, these women, they have suffered from complex post-traumatic stress disorder or whatever, CPTSD or whatever it is, that that is why they are psychopaths and narcissists. It's because they've been so because they've been damaged by the patriarchy. So you're going to continue the scapegoating, the ideological scapegoating that this war was declared over. Anyway, I mean, this, you're not going to get down to the bottom of any of this unless you start calling a spade and see that these agents of chaos, they have created uh, their own perpetual dissatisfaction, which is in some sense part of being able to sustain this so-called gender identity, which is a kind of unsustainable psychopathology in itself, or a personality disorder in itself. Um, but I mean, again, I find it slightly disgusting that there are some academics saying, oh, well, this is just because so many people have complex post-traumatic stress disorder, and then they're manifesting in all these different variations, when it's very, very clearly linked to feminist ideology. I mean, come on, you can't even talk about the intellectual, cultural edifice that it's fucking attached to. I mean, what a fucking waste of time this is. This is a form of dishonesty. This is a form of pseudo-intellectualism. I mean, it's actually disgusting to listen to this. I guess, someone coming from academia, this is the best that they can do. They can they can vaguely, indirectly point and gesture at the elephant in the room. That's all they can fucking come up with, and it's even scary for them to do that. It's I'm sorry, but this is why we live in a decadent culture that's falling apart, because the academics themselves are just it's a form of institutional corruption. Quite frankly, it's deplorable. It just shows the lack of integrity in all of our structures, because they just have to toe this lowest common denominator sentiment. You can't poke the bear. You can't raise the ire of these feminist agents of chaos, as it were, or whatever, and they even get placated to by the cerebral gymnastics that have to be performed in order to continually insulate their position. So you can kind of say, oh yeah, well mental health is a bit of a mess all over the place here, but we can't talk about the ideas that they comport to. We can just talk about the grievances that supposed philosophy and ideology keeps on using to excuse its never-ending bullshit. Anyway, I guess I've said my piece and I'm just repeating myself, but yeah, this is yeah. I haven't listened to the last 6 minutes of this recording, but I don't want to make another addendum. This is